Hey everyone, it is Thursday night at 8 p.m., so you know what this is. It's Lit Talks, and we do this every Thursday at 8 p.m. So far, it's been great. I am excited about tonight's text, and I know I always say that, but the beauty of this is that I get to read stuff that I really love as opposed to things that are mandated by somebody. So yes, I am always going to say I love this text, because if I don't, then kind of what's the point? I'm gonna give a few seconds to let some people come on. I know I'm being super generous with a few seconds. Okay, so here is the book that I'm going to be reading. And if some of you looked at my Instagram stories, you saw that I posted a picture of this. This is the leftovers from a dog attack. If you ever thought about just like really choking out an animal, okay, that was me when I came home and my dog had my books all over the floor, and some of them looked like this. So it's funny, I have this book all highlighted and underlined. Hey Isa, I have this book all highlighted and underlined, so it kind of sucks that the book got so damaged, because the first 36 pages, like, you can't even see what's written on both sides of it. But I'm able to make good use. I know the text pretty well, and we'll work with it. So anyhow, as I said, today we're going to be looking at Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This book is, or I should say this essay is, it's sort of like one of those life-changing texts. I remember reading it and going like, holy cow, this is like on another level. The essay is actually a combination of a lot of entries that he wrote in his journal over the span of like the last 10 years of his life, and he put them together, and the title is Self-Reliance, and really that's what it's talking about. I think if I can take one little saying from it, it would be insist on yourself, never imitate. And so Emerson goes through this process of talking about how unique we are and how society is like in a conspiracy to squash that, and what we can do and why we should insist on ourselves, why we should never imitate. So, I mean, just really, really excellent text. So I'm going to kind of go through it chronologically, or I'm going to at least try to. And I'm going to start with the very first paragraph. And in that first paragraph, he talks about the self, like the individual, as being connected to the universal. So he says to believe your own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. So if we're really being true to ourselves, if we're really listening to ourselves, what he's saying is that our feelings of what is true and what is right and what is good and what's proper, that it's going to connect to people, that people are going to understand it and they're going to respect it if we're being true to ourselves. And that he even goes so far as to say that laws don't concern him, which was revolutionary at the time. And he said a lot of things that were very, what was that sound? He said a lot of things that were very unorthodox, and that's what he's about. And he's encouraging people in this essay to be unorthodox. So he said that we should all, a man should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across his mind from within, more than the luster of the firmament of bards and sages. So for most of us, we go out searching for wisdom, that we are looking to others, sages and barbs and lecturers, and the people who are looked up to around us, or people from the past, and that we don't spend enough time listening to ourselves. What is it that we want? What is it that we think is right? And he uses this really great example that just like really hit home with me. He says, in every great work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. And then it says, he's saying, speak like your thoughts, because if you don't, here's what's going to happen. He says, Or else tomorrow, a stranger will say with masterly good sense precisely what we have thought and felt all the time, and we shall be forced to take with shame our own opinions from another. So sometimes we have a thought and it might seem a little strange, a little unorthodox, or just unpopular. And sometimes maybe we have self-doubt. We don't think that it's good enough, that it's worth saying, or that it's right, or that it will be accepted. And so we stay quiet. Maybe we're just too shy and we stay quiet. And then what happens is someone else comes along and states this opinion loudly and boldly, hi, and everyone, and they get the credit for it. And then we have to almost, in a sense, with shame, take our own opinions, our own thoughts from someone else. Because now we can't take credit for it, right? We can't say, well, that was my original thought, or that's what I was saying all along. Why didn't you say it? So he's talking about the value of our individual thoughts, and he really goes in depth in this essay in a great way. So he says, there's a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance, that imitation is suicide, that he must take himself, for better, for worse, as his portion. And then he compares it to us all being given like a little plot of land, a little plot of soil to till. And he says that it's foolishness, it's really silly to look over at someone else's plot of land or that person's plot of land and wish that we had that one and neglect our own. And he talks about the self in a very divine way. He gives this really great description of us. He says that we are all a divine idea. He says, we but half express ourselves and are ashamed of that divine idea which each of us represents. So if you think about a divine idea, it's like God had all of these ideas, and each of us is a manifestation of that idea. I have this idea for this personality or this type of person, or these combinations of talents and whatever it may be, that we're all an individual, unique, divine idea. And so when we're looking to other people's plot and wishing for that one or despising our own, that we're really, in a sense, disrespecting God and his divine idea, that we're ashamed of his idea for us. And so he says, God will not have his work made manifest by cowards. A man is relieved and gay when he has put his heart into his work and done his best, but what he has said and done otherwise shall give him no peace. It is a deliverance which does not deliver. In the attempt, his genius deserts him. No muse befriends him. No invention, no hope. So just think about someone, years as a teacher, I've had this experience where students might be presented with something where they have to come up with an original thought about it, an interpretation, and they are almost relieved to hear someone else's thought or idea because now they have a place to start. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but what he's saying is if we're going to exert all of our energy on someone else's idea, someone else's thoughts, someone else's lifestyle, way of living, or creativity, then we're not going to get any peace out of that. The only way that we're going to get peace is if we fully cultivate the plot that we've been given, or the talents, the skills, our uniqueness. And I just think that that's really beautiful, and I thought it was sort of like a real like slap of truth when he's like, God doesn't want his work being manifested in cowards. He's going to give it to people who are willing to go out there and do something with it. So he also talks about accepting the place of divine providence, or accepting the place that we are born into, the time that we're born into, the family that we're born into, the circumstances. Not saying that we have to accept our circumstances and say, oh, well, there's nothing I can do about this. But he's talking about the way that people look to other times and other places. We look to history and say, look at the great buildings of Rome, look at the great artists of the past, and we wish almost, maybe if I were born in a different time, or if I was born under different circumstances. And so he explains that, or he brings up the point that all great works of art and genius and architecture, those people made the best with the time and the circumstances of their life. And they did what they could with that time, because that was part of their genius, is doing something great within the structure or the confines of their time. So he says, great men have always done so and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age. And so he talks about a little bit further, let me just make sure that I'm covering everything here. He says something that's very similar to Hamlet's soliloquy, to be or not to be. He says that we are jailed by our consciousness and by conformity, or the fear of not conforming, the fear of seeming wishy-washy. He says, but the man is, as it were, clapped into jail by his consciousness. As soon as he has once acted or spoken with eclat, like with energy or with passion, he is a committed person, watched by the sympathy or the hatred of hundreds, whose affections must now enter into his account. So basically, we're concerned with looking good. So once we say something and we say it passionately, everything we do after that tends to be based on that past statement. So I don't want to look like a hypocrite. I don't want to look like a person who doesn't know what they're talking about. I don't want to seem like a person who's like not firm in my convictions. So because of our consciousness and because of our concern for what other people might think of us, we imprison ourselves. And he talks a little bit more about that afterwards, but he goes on to describe society. And I mean, just listen to this description. He says, society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree, for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder, to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. It loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. So it's like, let's all agree, in order to survive, that we're going to sort of take a middle road, that we're going to like shave off any rough edges or anything that doesn't quite fit into the mold that we've agreed works for all of us. And then he talks about something that was, as I said, really non-traditional. He talks about how good and bad is all based on the person. He says, and I mentioned before, that he doesn't abide by laws. Like, what do laws and histories and customs and tradition have anything to do with him? And he says that good and bad is basically just a label that we use. He says, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve you to yourself and you shall have the suffrage of the world. So the world will vote for you if you stick to your own mind and your own beliefs. Now, this was a period of time where the church had a lot of impact, right? And here he's saying that no one can tell you what is good or bad. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable. And then he starts saying that what he deems good or bad, what he feels is good or bad in his soul, is what he goes by. And so yeah, you can imagine that he irked a lot of people with that statement. He talks about the importance of whim and following one's whim or one's fancy. And he says that whim sounds sort of like a flaky word. Like, I'm just following my whim. And he says, I can't think of a better word for it. No use spending all this time trying to figure one out. But he said that he would shun, he says, I shun father and mother and wife and brother when my genius calls me. I would write on the lintels of the doorpost, whim. Expect me not to show cause why I seek or why I exclude company. So he says, if my whim tells me that I want to seek company, or that I want to be in solitude, I don't owe people an explanation for that. It's because my whim told me so. And so self-trust for him is a very important, I don't want to say like a doctrine, but a tenet and a way of living that And for some, they might say, well, it sounds like selfishness and it sounds like self-centeredness. But he's saying that when we are focused on ourselves, then, and when we're cultivating ourselves and being true to ourselves, that's when we have the most power to put good out into the world. And when we're conforming, when we're finding this middle ground, when we're not exercising our talents, our skills, our gifts, and our uniqueness, then we're not helping the world. We're not doing the best for it. And that's what the real shame is. I know Marie Forleo always says, she says that special gift that only you have. And he's going by that same thinking, that you have a special gift and only you have that particular gift. And we need to stop placating society, placating our family and our friends and everything else that gets in the way of exercising our genius and really building it as much as we can. So I'm sort of skimming through the major themes here and the major ideas. There's a lot more that goes on in this text, so I really, really, really highly recommend it. So he says, what I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. And he says, it is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps the perfect sweetness of the independence of solitude. So yeah, when we're around other people, it's easy to kind of go with the crowd, right? And when we're in solitude, it's easy to have these ideas that may or may not conform. But to be amongst people and to keep our same level of to keep our minds clear and pure and to keep our own thoughts strong and to hear it loudly, he says that's what greatness is. I sort of relate it to, so I love music, right? I love listening to music. And I always know like exactly what I'm in the mood to listen to and exactly what's right at that moment. But for me, anytime I'm with a group of people and they say, oh, do the music, all of a sudden for me, and I don't know if anyone else has this issue, but then it starts getting really cloudy for me. I'm like, oh, is this the right thing? Is that? And I'm trying to interpret the vibe of the place, and it just like clouds and confuses me. And now I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but what he's saying is that the virtue is being able to say, I don't necessarily care what you're thinking. I'm going to be able to tune that out, to listen to what's coming from myself, to be able to hear myself amidst all the noise and to be proud of what I come up with. So it can be tough, but I mean, I think it's such a great lesson for all of us. So he talks about, let's continue. He says, we come to wear one face, one cut, let me start that over. He says, we come to wear one cut of face and figure and acquire by degrees the gentlest asinine expression. So here he talks about, sort of sitting back and just watching people. And he describes, he's sort of making fun of this fake smile that people put on because we don't want to upset anyone. And he says that our actions are always based on other people's expressions. So that man, woman, goes around studying people's faces, and that if the crowd looks displeased, then we go away sad and dejected, or we may even change our behaviors or try to change our own minds to conform. And if they're happy with us, then we're pleased with ourselves. But then he talks about how fickle that is and how people's opinions change from liking something to disliking something, just like the winds in a newspaper blowing down the street. So why is it that our sense of peace, happiness, accomplishment, worth, value, why should it be dependent on other people? And then he talks about the other terror that scares us from self-trust is our consistency. And this is continuing from what he had talked about before. He says, a reverence for our past act or word because the eyes of others have no other data. So because people from the outside have no other way of judging us or knowing what we're about besides what we've done in the past or what we've said in the past, then we become fearful of disappointing them. He says we loathe to disappoint them. And so we feel this need to stay the course, to be the person that they expect us to be, so that we don't let them down, right? So if something happens where now our opinion changes, maybe we have an experience that makes us flip 180, we go, well, I said this yesterday, I can't say this now, I'm gonna look like an idiot, or I'm gonna look unstable, or I'm going to look like somebody who doesn't have strong opinions. And this is probably one of the most famous lines in this entire text. I would even say, like, in literature, this is really well known. It says, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines." So, statesmen, politicians. Can a politician go out there and make statements, I believe this, and then go out tomorrow and change it? I mean, they can, right? But then they get the criticism of everyone. Well, he flip-flops, she flip-flops, right? Philosophers, they spend all these years developing this philosophy, right? And so they're more apt to stick to it and not be open to other ideas, or not be open to suggesting that they might be wrong. So people, or divines, people who follow certain religious doctrines, that it becomes really difficult for them to step outside of consistency, to be inconsistent. So he says that's a foolishness. And so then he gives this advice. He says, with consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said today. So you shall be sure to be misunderstood. Is it so bad then to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit. To be great is to be misunderstood. And that line, to be great is to be misunderstood, is also a very well-known line from this text. So, I mean, just look at the list of people who are misunderstood, right? And it says, is it really that bad to be misunderstood? And does it really matter to be misunderstood if you understand what it is that you're doing? But then he makes an interesting point. He says that we don't always understand what we're doing or why. That we don't always see the big picture. But here's what we can do. He says, there will be an agreement in whatever variety of actions, so they be each honest and natural in their hour. So if we're really listening to ourselves, if we're being true to ourselves, and if we're seeking truth, then the things that we do are going to lead us. It's all that the dots are going to connect, whether we see it or not. Hi. So he says, he uses the example of a ship. He says one tendency unites them all. The voyage of the best ship is a zigzag line of 100 tacks. See the line from a sufficient distance, and it straightens itself to the average tendency. Your genuine action will explain itself and will explain your other genuine actions. Your conformity explains nothing. So if you do something, you feel that this is right, this action is right for me, and it's something that I should try, something that I should do, and then the next day, you don't exactly know why, but you feel like you're being led in this way. If you're open to that, then even if you don't see where it's going exactly, even if you don't know why, that in the end, if you're being true to yourself, you're going to be sticking to a good path. And it's all going to line up, that all of your past actions are going to make sense when you look back and when you look from a distance. And so he says, your conformity explains nothing. He says that he can't get to know a person who conforms, because why are you doing this? Why are you going to this church? Why are you with this political movement? Why do you have these friends? Why are you getting this education? He says that when people are conformists, that everything that they do now becomes suspect. And so he's making really big statements in a time where tradition was very important, very valuable. And I mean, it still is. We can say, I actually took the time because I wanted to be a bit of a dork. And when you look up definitions in Google, I don't remember what the first link is, but it'll tell you the history of the word and its usage and how often it was found. So the word consistency was used less in his time than it's used now. So he said at one point, he goes, I wish that we could get rid of this word consistency. Can we just all agree that the word consistency is ridiculous and stop using it and stop living our lives in that way? But no, the word consistency is showing up a lot more now. Okay, so then let's continue on. What else does he talk about? I've written lots of notes here. He says that another issue that we have is that we are scared from self-trust. So he says that we're loath to disappoint people, right? That, oh, actually, let me go back a minute. He talks about us as being people who are asleep. He says that he looks at people, and most of us are just kind of sort of going on autopilot. And that we're asleep, and every once in a while we wake up and we look around and we're astonished. But he makes this statement about society, that society will, he says, for nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. And so once we start to step a little bit outside, once we start to feel like, you know, maybe this custom or maybe this tradition or this action isn't right for me, that society, in order to, he sort of personifies society, in order to save itself, will swiftly put you back in your place or let you know that you're stepping out of line. Whether that's shunning you somehow or outright speaking against you, it's something that scares people. And so let's continue on. There's so much in this, guys, and I don't want to rush through it. But I also want to make sure that I'm taking the time to get to everything that I wanted to. I'm always like, oh, I wanted to mention this. Hey, Tom, how are you? Okay, so let's see, what else have we got here? He talks about the way that that people go through the world. He says, man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright. He dares not say, I think, I am, but quotes some saint or sage. And so here's something that he spends a lot of time talking about, that we are trained in a sense, or scared, to trust our own thoughts, to trust what we feel is right for us in our lives. And so we look to sages and we look to saints for advice. And he's saying that they had their moments, they had their time, and they had their wisdom, but each age and each person and each experience has its own wisdom. And so why should we shun ourselves and be ashamed of our experiences or think that they're less worthy, and to think that they won't teach us as much? And so, again, he's talking about the value of our uniqueness and our individuality. He says, man postpones or remembers. So here he's talking about living in the present. He says he does not live in the present, but with reverted eye laments the past, or heedless of the riches that surround him, stands on tiptoe to foresee the future. And he says that this lack of contentment will never bring happiness. We're either looking to the past with rose-tinted glasses and saying, well, you know, Shakespeare was great, and that age was great, and the architecture then was beautiful. Or we're standing on tiptoe looking for a future that's going to bring all sorts of happiness and bring us the peace that we seek. And he's saying that that is not the case. Here he starts talking about man and his relationship with God, specifically prayer. And remember, and for those of you who are just joining, we're reading Self-Reliance, or we're discussing Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So remember that he talks about human beings as being a divine idea, that we're all a divine idea. And because we are, that our relationship with God should be greater than what he is seeing. So he talks about prayer, and he says that prayers are a lot like begging, and that prayers should not be begging, that prayers should be a thankfulness and it should be joyful. And remember that the text is called Self-Reliance. So he goes on to spend some time saying that everything in nature helps itself, that nothing in nature begs, but that the universe will help those who make the effort to help themselves. And so here he says, nature suffers nothing to remain in her kingdoms, which cannot help itself. The vital resources of every animal and vegetable are demonstrations of the self-sufficing and therefore self-relying soul. But now we are a mob. Man does not stand in awe of man. We don't put ourselves in communication with the eternal ocean. He says that we beg of the water from urns of dead men, that we seek knowledge from people who have died, from people who have already walked the earth, instead of looking for the knowledge and the inspiration that's all around us right now. And so he then talks about the beauty and the importance of seeking solitude. And not solitude just to sit around. He said that solitude shouldn't be mechanical, that we should have a purpose for it, that we should be seeking to understand ourselves, seeking to connect with nature, to connect with the universe, to quiet society, to quiet the outside world, and get a strong sense of who we are. So let's see, what else does he say? And then he talks about, so a lot of times, because Emerson spent a lot of time out in the woods and a lot of times living a solitary life away from people, you know, others would say that, oh, well, he's sort of a hermit or a misanthrope and he doesn't like people. But that's not the case. He had friends, he liked people, but he makes a really good point about the society that we keep. And he says, if you are noble, I will love you. If you are not, I will not hurt you and myself by hypocritical attention. So I'm not going to spend time away from my life and spend time wasting your time in being hypocritical and pretending to like you. And he says, if you are true, but not in the same truth with me, cleave to your companions and I will seek my own. So if we're in disagreement, if we don't sync up, all right, if we're in disagreement, if we don't sync up, if we don't have like the same vibe or the same ideas, that's fine. I'll go find my companions, you go find your companions, and we'll be happy. And in that way, we are joined because we're working together, and we're building ourselves and our societies. We're bringing more happiness into the world and more unity, as opposed to the hypocrisy that he sees. Because he says that part of our role in society, in a conforming society, is to placate people, to placate everyone. So he says, I cannot sell my liberty and my power to save their sensibility. It's like, if you don't like me, I'm sorry. This is easier said than done, folks, and I'm sure you all know that. Okay, so let's see. What else does he talk about here? Finding your people. He spent some time talking about the fear of failure, which, I mean, is a topic that I love and that I've talked about a little bit. And he says, if our young men miscarry in their first enterprises, they lose all heart. If the young merchant fails, men say he is ruined. If the finest genius studies at one of our colleges and is not installed in an office, some job within 1 year afterwards, in the cities or suburbs of Boston or New York, it seems to his friends and to himself that he is right in being disheartened and in complaining for the rest of his life. And so here he's talking about how society dictates, or at least tries to, dictate what success looks like. And because it's so rigid, the idea of success, that the youth become very disheartened when their endeavors don't work out, right? I mean, think about how many times we've failed at something. And so people are quick to say, he's ruined, he's destroyed, he made the wrong decision, he's a fool. And so the reaction to that is that people just don't act. They don't take chances. They're terrified of failure. And then we get this like very homogenous, very middle ground, very lukewarm society where everyone is playing it safe. And so again, I mean, there's so much greatness here. He starts talking about travel, which I thought was really interesting. He makes this point that traveling is great, and he's actually pretty well traveled himself. But he says that Americans in particular have this dying urge to travel the world. And it's not necessarily just to see the art and beauty and experience new things, but that many people are traveling to escape something, to escape their life or to escape themselves. And he talks about how they go to see these monuments and see this architecture, and he describes it better than I do. So let me read this really quick. He says, "At home I dream that at Naples, at Rome, I can be intoxicated with beauty and lose my sadness. I pack my trunk, embrace my friends, embark on the sea, and at last wake up in Naples, and there besides me is the stern fact, the sad self, unrelenting, identical, that I fled from. I seek the Vatican and the palaces. I affect to be intoxicated with sights and suggestions, but I am not intoxicated. My giant goes with me wherever I go." And so he talks about how in America, so at the time we have all of these different waves, these trends, Stoic architecture, Gothic architecture, Renaissance architecture, right? And we're imitating Greek art and Roman art. And so we're looking to all of these other places, oftentimes places of antiquity, and we imagine that somewhere else is better. And yet when we're looking to travel, so for instance, if you ask most people, how is it that you find that you can enhance your life, right? I think one of the top answers, and I can say the same thing for myself, is that I would love to travel more. I want to see the world. And so he says that the issue here is that a lot of times people find, or they think of traveling as a way of bettering themselves, to better who they are, to become more cultured, to become more educated, to become more experienced, to become a better person. And so what he's saying is travel can't make you a better person. Travel can't bring you peace. Travel can't bring you any sort of happiness. That all of those things come from within. That no matter where we are, if we have an issue with ourselves, it's just going to keep following us. And I love how he calls it a giant. So there are so many quotes in here that we can talk about. He says, again, insist on yourself, never imitate. Do that which is assigned to you, and you cannot hope too much or dare too much. If you're spending your times and your energy focusing on your strengths, focusing on what makes you happy, what makes you unique, what makes you feel fulfilled, then that's the best thing that you're doing for the world and that you're doing for your life. And it doesn't matter if what you want to do today is different from what you wanted to do yesterday. If what you think today is different from what you thought yesterday, that it's going to all come together and it's going to work out for the best if we're being genuine and if we're being true to ourselves. Of course, being true to ourselves means that we have to spend time to get to know who we are, right? If we're always listening to other people, always absorbing and not silencing the external to listen to the internal, if we're not spending time to cultivate ourselves, then we're not going to know, and we're more easily going to sort of fall into the trap that society has laid out, or the plan that society has laid out. Do this, and then do this, and then do this, and then society says, then you'll be happy, right? And we've obviously seen that that's not always the case. What I think is really interesting is that, it's, first of all, this particular work and his other writings had a really strong influence on his society at that time. A lot of people really took to heart what he was saying, like Walt Whitman, for instance. He was an American writer, and he really embodied the American spirit of independence. But what he was saying is like, yes, we have this spirit of independence, right? But really, how independent are we? And so there were a lot of people who agreed with him, but even the people who disagreed with him, they had to sort of make a statement about why they disagreed, because I mean, for me, this is just like, there's just so much like truth in it. And this is a work that I've gone back to numerous times where I start to doubt, I feel in my gut that this is a good thing. This is something that I would love to pursue. And then you hear, you get some outside information. Well, maybe not. And then you start to question, right? And you start to doubt. And sometimes we, like I said, we're on autopilot and we don't really realize that we're just following something without thinking. It's like, well, why am I doing this? And why do I think this way? And why am I making this decision? So it's sort of a reminder to always be pausing and paying attention to the decisions that we're making. And is there another way? And why is this the way that I'm going? And what is my heart telling me? I think that whole idea of like follow your heart, it's kind of cliche and also kind of scary, because sometimes you're like, you're wrong, heart, you're wrong. And he's not saying to just do whatever you feel like in a reckless way. He does talk about the value and the importance of really getting to know ourselves and really understanding our motivations. But then once we do, like, go with it, okay? If you really feel strongly about something, go with it. And what's the worst that could happen? The failure, again, another cliche, but the failure is in not trying. And the failure is in not letting our voices be heard. And the failure is sort of like hiding our uniqueness and not putting out that contribution to the world. I think for a period of time I had that quote, the foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, because I just thought it was the best insult and the best reminder. And so anyhow, again, I recommend this book to everyone. I'm playing around with the time a little bit to see how everything goes. Please give me likes and hearts and thumbs up and all that stuff, because I'm trying to make because I like them. And let me know what you think about this. It's not a long text at all. It's like maybe 40 pages. And it's a really quick read, and it's just packed with really good information, really good reminders for us, especially if you're dealing with situations where maybe you have an idea, you have a thought, and you don't have a good support system. Or maybe you have a lot of negative self-talk because you want to do something that maybe you don't see all around you. Or maybe it's not on the right side of society or conformity, right? If you just need like an extra push to just have faith in yourself and to trust yourself and to kind of tune out whether it's negative talk or contrary talk, then absolutely Self-Reliance. And there are other essays in here that are also really, really great. So anyhow, I'm done with this, and I'm probably going to be like, I didn't say this or that. But I don't want to ramble just to fill up the time. Let me know what you guys think about these. If there's like some sort of a format that you like, or if there's like a text that you're sort of interested in and you'd like to discuss, then like absolutely let me know in the comments or DM me or anything like that. So I want to make these as interesting as possible, and I can totally do that with your help. As a side note, I took my hair out of a ponytail like 2 seconds before. I actually started at 8:01, which was the first time that I was late to this because I did not like the way that my hair was. And I was like, I'm gonna take it out of the ponytail and hope for the best. So anyhow, if I was messing with it quite a bit, I apologize. Thank you guys so much for coming by. I really do appreciate it. This is unprofessional of me right now. But I hope that you guys have a great night. Let me know what it is that you think. Give me a like. If you know anyone who's like sort of a geek or interested in literature, philosophy, history, all of that stuff, then like, you know, let them know what we're doing over here. All right, thank you. Bye.